I first laid eyes on Golden Oak Hills in early autumn, when the leaves on the stately oak trees lining the streets turned brilliant shades of orange and red. After years of living in crowded city neighborhoods, the rows of well-spaced homes, each with a tidy lawn and a clean driveway, seemed like a dream. When I pulled up to a cozy two-story house with a wide porch and a swing, I felt a tingle of excitement. This was where I wanted to settle. A sign at the entrance to the development welcomed me with gentle grandeur. "Welcome to Golden Oak Hills, a safe, serene community for all." That phrase was particularly appealing to me. I had dedicated my career to traffic safety, working my way up from local roadway design to a national role as a traffic safety enforcement specialist. Though only a handful of federal colleagues knew my official capacity, to most folks, I was just an engineer or consultant who traveled frequently. Moving to a tranquil suburban enclave promised respite from the tension of big city commutes and highway expansions. I craved weekends spent reading on the porch, sipping tea, and waving to neighbors strolling by. My real estate agent mentioned Golden Oak Hills was run by a mild homeowners association, one that took pride in uniform landscaping and well-kept roads. I had no reason to suspect otherwise. HOAs typically worried about fence heights and mailbox colors, not specialized tasks like road engineering. If anything, I hoped they'd appreciate my expertise in ensuring safer streets. I quickly learned, however, that in Golden Oak Hills, there was a single, overbearing personality overshadowing the rest. Her name was Brenda Farncross, though nearly everyone privately referred to her as Karen. A middle-aged woman with a meticulously coiffed blonde bob, she was the treasurer of the HOA. She seemed determined to interpret her volunteer role as absolute authority over the neighborhood's appearance, finances, and, fatally, traffic control. On my very first evening in my new home, Karen arrived, clipboard in hand, lips set in a thin line. She pointed out I had parked my SUV slightly angled in the driveway and reminded me the HOA guidelines required vehicles to face the street squarely. That was my initial warning sign, but I believed I could handle it. After all, how bad could a single officious neighbor be? Little did I know, Karen's obsession with correcting the roads of Golden Oak Hills would soon spiral out of control, leading to chaos, injuries, and legal battles. It was a conflict that forced me to reveal my true position as a national traffic safety enforcer and bring her reckless ambitions crashing down. I soon discovered that Karen's influence spread far beyond polite suggestions. She effectively dictated how the HOA funds were used. Harold, the aging HOA president, was soft-spoken and seemed to let Karen run the show. Her iron-fisted approach to neighborhood standards had earned her nicknames unfit for polite company, but publicly, residents addressed her as Ms. Farncross, rarely Karen to her face. My second week in Golden Oak Hills, a neighbor named Marjorie casually warned me, "Best keep your lawn precisely 2 inches high, or she'll slip you a violation notice. She finds people over everything: length of grass, mailbox color, flower choices." Marjorie laughed, but there was a tremor of genuine anxiety in her voice. At that point, Karen's tyranny seemed limited to cosmetic issues, albeit petty ones. However, as the days passed, I noticed she took an almost fanatic interest in the neighborhood's roads. Golden Oak Hills had wide, well-paved streets. One reason I'd picked it, but Karen frequently grumbled about speeding drivers putting children at risk. To be fair, many suburban communities do worry about cars zipping through. But from my vantage, the posted limit of 25 miles per hour felt safe. I rarely saw anyone going above 30 miles per hour. The roads had gentle curves, plenty of stop signs, and decent visibility. There was no evidence of a speeding epidemic. Still, I heard Karen mention at an HOA meeting that she wanted drastic measures to slow people down. She spat the words like a threat, her eyes gleaming with determination. One mild Saturday morning, I stepped outside to see a group of residents gathered near the entrance gate, where Karen stood on a small ladder, gesturing at the road. She was describing her brilliant plan to a bored-looking contractor. As I got closer, I caught phrases like extremely high speed bumps and teach them a lesson. A chill prickled along my neck. I recognized from professional experience how improper speed bumps could endanger drivers, cyclists, and pedestrians. Yet Karen seemed unstoppable, brandishing the HOA budget like a weapon. I made a mental note to keep watch. This was a situation that could escalate. 2 days later, laminated flyers appeared in everyone's mailbox. Announcement from the HOA. We will be installing speed bumps throughout Golden Oak Hills to ensure safety. Work will begin next week. Please comply with all signs and directions. Treasurer Farncross. No mention of cost, no open vote, no professional traffic study, just a unilateral declaration. Neighbors whispered complaints, but seemed resigned. The speed bumps would be installed in phases, starting with the neighborhood's long Main Street, Oak Hollow Drive. That was the central artery leading to most homes, including mine. As a national traffic safety enforcer, though I kept that identity under wraps, I recognized immediate red flags. Speed bumps, if done properly, must adhere to guidelines regarding their height, width, and spacing. Municipalities often require engineering studies to verify a need before installing them. Improperly built bumps can damage cars, trigger accidents, and cause spine or neck injuries if hit at normal speeds. Some residents with chronic back pain or sensitive medical conditions suffer greatly when forced to jolt over poorly designed humps day after day. I confronted Karen about these concerns in front of her house one late afternoon. She was sweeping her pristine porch, wearing a scowl. At the edge of her yard, a half-dozen pink flags marked where a contractor had measured potential placements for humps. "Ms. Farncross," I said, attempting politeness, "I see the HOA is moving fast on the speed bumps. Have you had an official traffic study done? Some guidelines specify the shape and maximum height. There could be real risks if they're too tall." Karen set her broom aside, crossing her arms. "We don't need bureaucratic red tape telling us how to protect our children. People drive too fast, and speed bumps are the solution. End of story." I try to reason with her. I'm concerned about injuries and vehicle damage if the humps are improperly installed. There are recommended standards from traffic safety organizations. She cut me off, her voice sharp. "We'll do it our own way. This is private property, not a public highway. I already have the board's backing and the funds. If people can't slow down, they'll learn the hard way." Shaking my head, I left, my chest tight with frustration. Karen's arrogance was almost comedic, but the potential harm she might cause was very real. I decided I would keep monitoring the situation. If her installations posed a danger, I'd escalate the matter. But I still hoped local reasoning would prevail. After all, if the rest of the HOA realized the potential liabilities, maybe they'd curb her mania. Construction began early Monday morning. By midday, a row of brand-new speed bumps jutted across Oak Hollow Drive, each a monstrous, sharply angled mound of asphalt. Passers-by slowed to a crawl, some wincing at the thunk-thunk as their cars lurched over them. A few folks got out to inspect the bumps up close, muttering about how steep they were. Even at 10 miles per hour, the jolt felt severe, as if driving over a small curb. That evening, I watched from my living room window as a delivery truck rumbled in the neighborhood. The driver, likely unaware of the new hazards, hit the first bump at around 20 miles per hour. A sickening scrape cut through the air, followed by the clang of metal. The truck lurched violently, bouncing over the hump, then shuddered to a stop. Fluid leaked onto the road. I rushed out, joined by concerned neighbors. The delivery driver, shaken, climbed out. He discovered a torn oil pan and a dented undercarriage. Karen, alerted by the commotion, strolled over, her brow furrowed in feigned concern. The driver glared at her. "Whoever put that thing there owes me thousands in repairs." Karen pursed her lips. "You must have been speeding. These humps are well within our right to install." I stepped in, heart pounding. He wasn't going excessively fast, and that speed bump is dangerously high. Look at the damage it caused. But Karen's face hardened. If he was abiding by the posted limit of 25, there'd be no issue. The HOA isn't liable. The driver scoffed, pulling out his phone to call his company. Meanwhile, a small crowd gathered, whispering about potential lawsuits, how this was just the first day, and already there was a serious incident. Karen remained unmoved, proclaiming that people must learn to slow down. At that moment, I knew I couldn't stand by. Someone could get injured, or worse. I resolved to contact local authorities, perhaps building officials. Even if Golden Oak Hills was private property, certain municipal codes often govern safe roadway design. But I also had a more potent card in my hand, my federal position. If push came to shove, I could bring the weight of national traffic safety regulations to bear. For now, though, I tried the local route, hoping it wouldn't escalate into a fiasco. On Tuesday, I phoned the county's public works department, explaining the situation. The official I spoke to sounded sympathetic but constrained. If it's a private HOA road, we can't just tear anything out without formal permission, he said. We can come do an inspection if residents file a complaint. But typically, HOAs have broad powers on roads they maintain themselves. I pressed him on safety. Even private roads can't be hazards that cause repeated damage or injuries, right? There's a line where it becomes a public safety concern, he agreed. I'll see if we can schedule an inspection soon. Maybe next week. Next week? By then, Karen would have installed more lumps and lumps. She seemed to be forging ahead with a complete plan to place them on every major street in Golden Oak Hills. In the meantime, the fiascos kept stacking up. A small sedan lost its bumper after hitting the newly installed hump, the driver nearly bursting into tears over the unexpected expense. An elderly neighbor with back problems complained that even at a crawl, crossing these humps caused severe pain, making it almost impossible for her to leave home without risking agony. A mother pushing a stroller tripped at the steep edge of a hump that encroached onto the sidewalk, scraping her knee and terrifying her toddler. Anger simmered among residents, but Karen dismissed every protest, brandishing the bylaws that gave the HOA wide latitude to ensure community safety. She insisted that if folks simply obeyed her ideal driving speed, she claimed 5 to 10 miles per hour was plenty in a residential area, there would be no problems. In reality, her lumps were more akin to obstacles suitable for off-road trails than suburban streets. My frustration mounted. Each day, more neighbors turned to me, sensing I was the only one openly questioning Karen's approach. Can't you do something? They pleaded. Aren't there laws about how high a speed bump can be? If only they knew my full authority. But part of me still hoped I could handle this with minimal drama. I reached out to the HOA board directly, requesting an audience at their next meeting. Harold, the timid president, sighed. Karen is in charge of road improvements. But yes, come to the meeting. Maybe we can find a compromise. Compromise with a zealot seemed unlikely. Yet I held on to that last shred of optimism. That reason might prevail if enough voices objected. Meanwhile, each day brought new horror stories of bent axles, small collisions, near misses. The question was no longer if someone would be seriously hurt, but when. The HOA meeting took place on a Thursday evening in the community hall, a modest structure with a dozen folding chairs in front of a long table. Typically, only a handful of residents attended these monthly gatherings, but that night the room overflowed with anxious, angry neighbors. Word had spread about the speed bump chaos. At the center of the table sat Karen, flanked by Harold on one side and the HOA secretary, Belinda, on the other. Karen wore a smug expression, her arms folded as she watched the crowd fill the seats. A typed agenda was taped to the table. Financial updates, landscape committee report, road safety improvements. The tension in the room was palpable when Harold cleared his throat and began. Welcome, everyone. Let's start with some quick finance updates. He droned on about monthly dues, rummaging through a sheaf of papers. No one cared. They wanted to discuss the speed bumps. After a few minutes, Harold sighed. We see a lot of interest in the road improvements. Let's move to that item. Instantly, the dozen hands shot up. Karen took the microphone. As treasurer and road safety chair, I'm pleased to report that the first round of speed bumps is already reducing speeding. Yes, there have been a few issues, but that's because drivers aren't adjusting to the new normal. Safety requires vigilance. A chorus of protests erupted. My car's suspension was wrecked. My child fell and skinned her knee on that hump near the crossing. I heard someone's truck got totaled. This is insane. Karen let them vent before responding in a condescending tone. If you keep your speed under 10 miles per hour, These humps pose no threat. That set off even more outrage. I raised my hand. The room quieted, perhaps aware of my background. Harold nodded for me to speak. I'm John Travis, a new resident here. I want to emphasize that speed bumps must follow established engineering guidelines. The ones we have are dangerously high and abrupt. They exceed typical residential standards. People are getting hurt. It's a liability for the HOA. Karen arched an eyebrow. Liability? Our attorneys assure us we're protected because this is private property and the HOA is acting to promote safety. If drivers damage their cars, that's on them. I inhaled, mustering calm. I strongly disagree. Having served in traffic engineering roles, I avoided stating my exact federal position. I know that any roadway, public or private, must not present a known hazard. You could be sued by residents or even face local code enforcement. This is about real harm inflicted on good drivers. Tension rippled through the crowd. Karen shot me a frosty glare. Well, John, you may have your engineering opinions, but the HOA is committed to controlling speed. These humps are non-negotiable. We're actually planning more installations next week. Discussion closed. A wave of stunned silence fell. She had ended the conversation unilaterally, ignoring the outcry. That arrogance sealed the deal for me. If she thought her small realm was beyond outside intervention, she was about to learn otherwise. I locked eyes with Harold, who looked miserable, as if he wanted to intervene but lacked the spine to do so. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors crowded around, some thanking me for speaking up, others cursing the board's inflexibility. Karen slipped out briskly, refusing to acknowledge the clamor. My final illusions that we could solve this quietly were gone. She was forging ahead, unconcerned about consequences. And so I resolved to escalate. 2 days after the stormy HOA meeting, Karen's second phase commenced. Crews poured more lumps on Maple Lane and Cedar Ridge Road, using the same extreme design. Now half the neighborhood was dotted with these mini mountains of asphalt, each capable of jarring even the slowest driver. True to form, more mishaps occurred. A senior on an electric mobility scooter nearly flipped forward when crossing a bump bridging from the road onto the curb ramp. She was lucky to escape with minor bruises. A mail delivery van bottomed out, scattering letters across the street. Furious, the driver threatened to stop delivering mail if these stupid humps remained. A father of 2 posted photos on social media showing cracked rims after crossing a bump at just 12 miles per hour. Local frustration soared. Some posted outrage comments in the neighborhood Facebook group. Karen is unstoppable. Someone do something. We're sick of living in a test track for monster trucks. Has anyone contacted a lawyer? In the midst of the chaos, a quiet but growing group of residents called for an HOA recall vote, aiming to oust Karen from her position. But the bylaws made it difficult, requiring a supermajority of homeowner signatures. Meanwhile, Karen used the HOA's funds freely, presumably for more lumps, ignoring the building backlash. Harold tried behind-the-scenes attempts to slow her, but she steamrolled him, claiming public safety authority. No one seemed able to stand up to her head-on, except me, if I revealed my real role. I arranged a meeting with a local municipal inspector, urging him to come see the hazards. He arrived one afternoon, cruising the streets with me. We went over each newly installed bump, measuring their heights with a small portable tool. Many soared well above recommended guidelines. The inspector whistled. These are way beyond typical. But unless there's a direct city ordinance or an injured party sues, our hands are mostly tied. Still, I can file a report with the city council that might spur some action. I thanked him but felt the weight of time. Real injuries were happening. The question was whether Karen would be forced to listen before a catastrophic accident or lawsuit. I decided to prepare my own official report under my federal credentials. If the city wasn't stepping in promptly, I'd nudge them from the top down. The problem was, once I invoked my national authority, subtlety would vanish. My anonymity would end, and Karen would see me as a direct threat. So be it, I thought. Protecting people mattered more than any neighborly facade. That evening, I drafted a detailed complaint referencing Federal Highway Administration, FHWA, guidelines, and widely accepted engineering standards for local roads. Though Golden Oak Hills was private, our national body of road safety guidelines offered a strong argument that these speed bumps constituted a hazard. Even private roads used by the public, delivery drivers, mail carriers, can fall under certain safety regulations, especially if the design is proven to cause frequent damage or bodily harm. I sent the complaint to my contacts at the National Traffic Safety Commission, along with photographs, videos, and statements from affected neighbors. I didn't explicitly order an intervention. I simply requested a formal review. But my position carried weight, and I suspected it would set off alarm bells. The commission had, in rare cases, forced private roads to adjust or remove hazards that threatened broader safety. This was shaping up to be one of those times. Within days, I got a phone call from an acquaintance in the commission. "John, this is serious. We're not used to seeing something so egregious in a suburban HOA. We'll escalate to the state level. Possibly, we'll coordinate with local government attorneys. Meanwhile, keep collecting evidence, especially if injuries occur." As much as I appreciated their support, I couldn't help but feel dread. Karen would soon realize that external forces were mobilizing. She'd guess I was behind it. If she'd compromised on anything else, maybe we could have avoided a meltdown. But her righteousness made negotiation impossible. Sure enough, by the weekend, rumors swirled that the feds were eyeing Golden Oak Hills. A neighbor told me Karen was furious, calling an emergency HOA board session to discuss interference by outside agencies. She suspected someone had tattled, though she didn't yet realize who. Or maybe she did suspect me, but had no proof. Meanwhile, the speed bump spree continued unabated. The contractors seemed paid to do a job, no questions asked, churning out lumps across side streets. Golden Oak Hills turned into a labyrinth of asphalt ridges, each jarring enough to blow tires if approached incautiously. Ambulance drivers, ironically needed more frequently now for injuries, complained that the lumps delayed response times and jolted patients in the back. The entire situation was turning from fiasco to fiasco, threatening a public health crisis. On a mild Wednesday morning, I found a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Notice of violation. Mr. Travis, you are in breach of HOA guidelines by storing a commercial or specialized vehicle in your driveway overnight. This is your first warning, with a $250 fine if not rectified. Treasurer Farncross. I stared at the notice, baffled. My SUV was a normal personal vehicle, hardly commercial. I suspected this was Karen's attempt to harass me. She discovered my frequent out-of-town trips and guessed I might be using some official or specialized truck. It was nonsense, but typical of her petty ways. I confronted her on the sidewalk as she did her daily patrol in a golf cart. This so-called violation is bogus. My car is a personal SUV, not commercial. She didn't flinch. Then prove it's not used for commercial transport. The rules prohibit any vehicle used for business unless kept in a closed garage. I ground my teeth. You can't just invent reasons to fine me. This is harassment. Karen's lip curled. Harassment? You're the one meddling in our neighborhood improvements, stirring up outside trouble. If you're so concerned about hazard, perhaps you'd prefer to live elsewhere. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to reveal my rank right then and there. Instead, I retorted, "You're risking serious legal liability with these speed bumps. Outside agencies are involved because you've endangered people. That's on you, not me." Her eyes flashed with anger, but she maintained a smug facade. "We'll see how the board and the lawyers handle it. Meanwhile, pay your fine, or keep your suspicious vehicle out of sight." She drove off, leaving me seething. It was a transparent attempt to intimidate me into backing down. Little did she know, her escalation only strengthened my resolve. I refused to pay the nonsensical fine, and I quietly emailed the commission about it, highlighting how Karen was retaliating against potential whistleblowers. This petty warfare wouldn't stop the wheels of justice. The turning point came one evening at dusk. The sun had just slipped behind the rooftops, and streetlights cast a soft glow over the asphalt lumps. I was walking my dog along Elm Crest Lane, one of the newly bumped roads, when I heard a sharp screech of tires, followed by a sickening thud and a woman's scream. I rushed forward, heart pounding, to find a minivan halted diagonally in the street. It had evidently struck a speed bump at moderate speed. The driver's side front wheel was bent at an odd angle, the rim shattered. The occupant, a mother, stumbled out, cradling her teenage daughter, who clutched her arm in pain. The girl had been unbuckled for a moment, rummaging in the back for something, when a violent jolt threw her forward. Her wrist was badly twisted. She moaned, tears streaming. Several neighbors converged, calling 911. The mother was distraught, pointing at the towering hump that had caused the crash. She insisted she wasn't speeding, maybe 20 miles per hour. Indeed, 20 miles per hour was typically acceptable for a standard speed bump, but these lumps were far from standard. My training told me the momentum of hitting such a steep gradient could cause a tire blowout or loss of control. Paramedics arrived, carefully helping the teenager onto a stretcher, stabilizing her wrist. Police officers followed, surveying the scene with grim expressions. The mother told them about the insane bumps the HOA had installed. One officer shook his head in disbelief when he measured the height. "I've seen plenty of speed humps, but nothing like this. It's borderline malicious." Karen arrived, drawn by the sirens. She tried to approach, but the mother shrieked at her. "You did this. My daughter is hurt because of your monstrous bumps." Karen stammered about driver responsibility, but the officer warned her to step back, hinting she might be interfering in an investigation. I quietly gathered photos of the scene, capturing the destroyed wheel, the monstrous hump, the ambulance. This was the exact scenario I had dreaded: an injured child, a near catastrophe. If Karen thought she could keep forging ahead, she was sorely mistaken. The local police now had a serious incident to investigate, and the mother seemed intent on suing. Meanwhile, I had direct proof of harm to share with the commission. The question was how quickly we could halt Karen's crusade before another tragedy struck. The next morning, the entire neighborhood buzzed with news of the accident. Social media threads exploded with condemnation of Karen and demands for immediate removal of the lumps. A newly created petition titled "Remove the Hazardous Speed Bumps Now" garnered hundreds of signatures from residents in less than 24 hours. People who once stayed silent about Karen's tyranny found fresh courage, especially after an innocent child was injured. Even the mild-mannered Herald called an emergency HOA meeting for that evening, presumably to address the outcry. Meanwhile, the mother from the crash had already hired a lawyer and filed a formal complaint with the local police. The lawyer's statement circulated. "We will hold the HOA and any responsible parties liable for installing unsafe barriers on a roadway accessible to the public, causing physical harm." Karen, under siege, tried to spin the story. She posted on the HOA website, "We regret the unfortunate accident on Elm Crest Lane. Speed bumps were installed to protect residents from reckless driving. We urge everyone to remain within posted limits, and we disclaim any liability for damages resulting from operator negligence." Her tone of cold blame incensed the neighborhood further. Calls for her resignation grew. The rumor was that even Harold wanted her gone but lacked the formal authority to fire the treasurer without a board majority vote. Not surprisingly, Karen still had a small circle of loyal supporters who believed she was fighting to keep our children safe from speed demons. Yet even they seemed shaken by the actual injury. Meanwhile, I received an urgent email from the commission's legal arm, referencing the accident. They asked if I could attend a special teleconference with state officials to discuss next steps. I recognized that the stage was set for a potential federal injunction or forced removal of the lumps. Part of me felt relief that the cavalry was coming. Another part felt anger that it had taken a child's broken wrist to prompt real action. That evening, I joined the teleconference, explaining the details to a panel of state attorneys and traffic engineers. They concluded that if local enforcement failed to mitigate the hazard soon, they would consider a direct enforcement action. My final words to them were, "We're dealing with an HOA official who believes she's above the law. This will likely escalate." The attorneys assured me they'd coordinate with city officials to serve a cease and desist if necessary. Then one official asked, Would you be willing to testify or demonstrate your professional authority if we go to court? I didn't hesitate. Absolutely, I said. I'll do whatever it takes. Thus, the legal storm clouds gathered, swirling around Karen and the HOA. Soon, she'd face more than just local complaints. She discovered that ignoring traffic safety regulations can bring down the might of city, state, and even federal entities. By 7 p.m. that night, the community hall was packed with residents. Many had come straight from work, still in professional attire, or wearing T-shirts emblazoned with slogans like "Safe Roads, Not Monster Bumps." There was an undercurrent of pin-up rage. Even those normally apathetic to HOA affairs felt compelled to show up. Karen sat behind the long table, as usual, flanked by Harold and Belinda. But her composure was rattled. Dark circles underscored her eyes, and though she tried to project authority, it looked forced. Harold began, voice shaky. "We've called this emergency meeting due to the unfortunate accident yesterday. We want to address public concern about the speed bumps." A rumble of discontent spread through the crowd. Karen cleared her throat. "These speed bumps are for safety. We cannot let one freak accident overshadow the fact that reckless driving is far more dangerous. If people were abiding by 10 or 15 miles per hour max, no one would be hurt." A resident interrupted with a shout. "A child broke her wrist. The driver wasn't going that fast." That unleashed a torrent of angry voices. At last, the mother from the accident rose, escorted by her lawyer. The crowd parted. The mother glared at Karen, tears shining in her eyes. "How dare you minimize what happened? My daughter might need surgery because you made the roads into a hazard course." Karen tried to respond, but the lawyer stepped up, voice cold and precise. "Ms. Farncross, we have ample documentation that these lumps far exceed typical specifications for residential speed bumps. You installed them with no professional oversight and no official traffic study. We are filing a lawsuit against you and the HOA for gross negligence." An electric hush fell. Even Karen's loyal supporters looked uneasy. Karen's jaw clenched, but she still tried to maintain her dogmatic stance. "I have the board's authority. We had a budget, and we followed standard practices." At that I stood. "You did not follow standard practices. I've worked in traffic safety for years, Ms. Farncross. There are well-established designs for safe speed humps. A certain height, a certain slope. Yours are double or triple the recommended maximum, causing real damage and injuries. If you continue to ignore this, the next incident could be far worse." Karen's eyes widened, zeroing in on me. "So you're the one who's been poking around with inspectors, calling in outside agencies?" She spat the words like an accusation. I held her gaze. "I'm simply trying to prevent more harm. You can't keep doubling down when the facts prove these lumps are dangerous. Remove them or re-engineer them properly before someone else is hurt." For a moment, she looked ready to explode. But Harold cut in, voice trembling with uncharacteristic resolve. "Karen, we need to take action. People are getting hurt, the police are investigating, and the threat of lawsuits is real. I move that we suspend further speed bump installations pending a professional review." The entire crowd erupted in applause. Karen looked around, seeing even Belinda nod in agreement. She realized she was cornered, at least temporarily. With a bitter scowl, she muttered, "Fine, we'll table new installations for now, but I won't accept removing the existing ones. They are saving lives." Then she banged her gavel to end the meeting, refusing further debate. Despite the partial victory, we knew the fight wasn't over. Karen's stubbornness was legendary, and with lawsuits looming, plus state or federal involvement, the conflict had only begun. The difference now was that the community no longer feared her. They demanded accountability, and I'd make sure they got it. In the days following the explosive meeting, the HOA board publicly announced they'd hired a civil engineer to assess the lumps. Officially, they were pausing further installations, though the existing lumps remained. Karen stayed uncharacteristically silent about it. She seemed to be reeling from the wave of backlash. The mother's lawsuit moved forward quickly, her lawyer seeking an injunction to remove or at least temporarily flatten the lumps. The police finished their on-scene investigation of the accident, concluding that while the driver wasn't obeying the extreme 5 to 10 miles per hour that Karen recommended, she wasn't speeding beyond the posted 25 miles per hour. The official report called the lumps significantly higher and steeper than typical residential speed humps, noting they contributed to the severity of the crash. Meanwhile, my colleagues at the commission kept me updated. The state's attorney general was reviewing whether these lumps posed a broader public safety hazard. If so, they could force the HOA to comply with national guidelines or face heavy fines. I shared the newest evidence, including the accident report, which solidified the case. The chain of events was unstoppable now. Karen's empire was under siege from multiple angles: lawsuits, state codes, possibly federal oversight. Even Harold, no longer cowering, started openly criticizing Karen's extremes in board emails. He apologized to residents, blaming himself for letting her run wild with the HOA budget. A recall petition circulated, quickly gathering well beyond the required supermajority. The writing was on the wall. Karen would be voted out of power if she didn't resign first. Yet she clung on. On a Saturday, I saw her puttering around the lumps in her golf cart, using a tape measure and scowling. Maybe she intended to gather data to defend them. In typical Karen fashion, she was convinced she could outsmart actual engineers and codes. But no tape measure could hide how dangerously tall those humps were. Friends and neighbors thanked me for my efforts. Some teased me about being a secret agent, not realizing how close that guess was. Others brought baked goods or invited me for dinner, expressing relief that someone with expertise was shining a light on Karen's fiasco. The sense of solidarity was heartening. Regardless of how much havoc she had caused, Golden Oak Hills had begun to unify in rejection of her tyranny. The lull ended abruptly when Karen launched a final, desperate counterstrike. Early one morning, bright red letters appeared spray-painted across some lumps. "Slow down or pay up, Karen F." This bizarre graffiti unsettled neighbors, who recognized her signature. She seemed to be doubling down on intimidation. Then, a new wave of HOA violation notices flooded mailboxes. Unkempt lawn, fines for minuscule height deviations. Unauthorized mailbox design for those who had replaced or repainted boxes. Parking too close to the sidewalk, infractions slapped on unsuspecting residents. It was obvious Karen was lashing out, trying to fill the HOA coffers to defend her lumps in court or punish those who opposed her. In essence, she declared war on the entire neighborhood. Emails flew back and forth among residents, vowing to ignore these absurd citations, suspecting Karen was misusing her treasurer power. Harold attempted to freeze the fines, but Karen apparently processed them unilaterally in the HOA system. Then, an ominous event occurred. A neighbor named Luis reported that nails and screws were scattered near the lumps on Maple Lane, flattening tires for several unsuspecting drivers. While no direct evidence tied Karen to the sabotage, many suspected she or her supporters were behind it, hoping to create fear or blame it on vigilantes. The vibe in Golden Oak Hills turned tense, borderline hostile. At that point, I realized the situation might escalate beyond mere litigation. Karen's recklessness had escalated into potential criminal acts. If nails were deliberately placed, it was vandalism or worse. I shared this info with the local police, who took statements and patrolled the area more frequently. They also told me they had an active open file on the speed bump fiasco, with the district attorney monitoring. The mother's lawsuit alone could bankrupt the HOA, but criminal charges might well be added if the sabotage was linked to Karen. Around that time, the commission decided it was time for a formal notice. They coordinated with the state attorney general's office and prepared a letter demanding the lumps be modified or removed, threatening heavy penalties if the HOA refused. They asked me to hand-deliver the letter to the next HOA meeting, given my local presence. Although it placed a target on my back, I agreed. Enough was enough. If Karen insisted on fighting, she'd face the combined might of local, state, and federal scrutiny. On a crisp Wednesday evening, the HOA convened its monthly board meeting. likely the last one Karen would ever attend as treasurer. Residents packed the community hall again, but this time, a uniformed police officer stood quietly in the corner, ensuring order. Word was out that tensions were high. I arrived with the official letter in my jacket pocket, heart pounding. As the meeting started, Harold stammered an introduction, then turned the floor over to the civil engineer the HOA had hired. That gentleman gave a damning report. The speed bumps in Golden Oak Hills do not meet recognized dimensions. They are excessively steep, creating potential for undercarriage strikes and occupant injuries. My recommendation is immediate removal or regrading. Applause erupted. Karen glowered. That's just one opinion. Our roads are private, and I have the board's mandate to ensure safety. The mother of the injured teen stood. Don't you dare repeat that nonsense. You almost cost my daughter her future in sports. She's in physical therapy now. Karen bristled, about to retort, but I stepped forward, voice firm. Karen Farncross. I hold a position with the National Traffic Safety Commission. Gasps rippled through the room. This was the first time I'd publicly declare my affiliation. Karen's face twisted with shock. I pulled out the letter, raising it for all to see. This is an official directive from state and federal authorities, demanding these lumps be brought into compliance or removed. If the HOA fails to act, you'll face steep fines and legal repercussions. Karen tried to snatch the letter. I held it out of reach, then calmly handed it to Harold instead. Harold's eyes widened as he read the content, color draining from his face. Then he spoke, voice trembling. Under threat of legal action, the board must comply. Ms. Farncross, you've overstepped. We have no choice but to remove or rework these lumps. Effective immediately. A wave of relieved murmurs spread among the crowd. But Karen refused to yield. This is outrageous. I was only protecting our neighborhood from speeders. How dare you bring the feds into our private community? I stared her down. People are injured, property is damaged, and you ignored every warning. You left us no choice. She scowled, turning to Harold. You're going to let him ruin everything we built. Harold stood taller than I'd ever seen him. Karen, your decisions placed this HOA at massive risk. We can't stand with you anymore. Then he hesitated. Also, we have his signatures to hold a recall vote. You're done as treasurer. An eruption of cheers and applause followed. Karen shrank back, her face pale, fury blazing in her eyes. You can't do this. You'll regret it. At that, the police officer stepped forward. Miss Farncross, calm down. We have a few questions about possible vandalism incidents. Please come with me for a statement. Karen whipped around, stunned. The entire crowd watched as she was escorted away. Not in handcuffs, yet, but clearly in disgrace. For a woman who had tried to control every aspect of Golden Oak Hills, it was a humiliating downfall. In the days that followed, events moved swiftly. Without Karen's interference, the HOA board met with contractors to plan the lump's removal or regrading. A local asphalt company offered a discounted rate after reading the dramatic news coverage. The mother's lawsuit advanced, with a new board acknowledging partial responsibility and seeking a settlement. They hoped to avoid a full trial by demonstrating that they were remedying the hazard. Meanwhile, Karen faced an increasingly grim legal landscape. The mother's lawsuit named her specifically as a co-defendant, citing personal negligence in authorizing the lumps. A wave of smaller claims from residents with damaged vehicles or injuries threatened to bankrupt her. The police investigation into sabotage, particularly the nails scattered on Maple Lane, remained open. Some suspicious financial records indicated Karen had used HOA funds in questionable ways to pay for personal road safety projects. The official letter from the commission hung over her head. If she tried to continue any speed bump mania on private property under her name, she'd face direct federal enforcement. With the lumps slated for removal, Golden Oak Hills began breathing easier. Crews started flattening the worst humps on Oak Hollow Drive first, returning them to standard height and gentler slopes. Each day, residents cheered as asphalt grinders shaved the lumps down to a more typical speed hump shape. Car suspensions heaved a collective sigh of relief. Karen, for her part, barricaded herself in her house. Rumor was she'd hired lawyers to fight the lawsuits, claiming she was only fulfilling her duty to protect neighbors. But with the HOA turning against her, she lacked the collective resources she once commanded. She was on her own, financially and socially isolated. One morning, a large for sale sign appeared on Karen's lawn. Some speculated she was trying to flee the scene before the legal judgments crashed down. Others guessed the HOA forced her out. Either way, her once immaculate yard now looked forlorn, as if reflecting its owner's downfall. A few neighbors reported seeing her pace by the window, shouting at someone on the phone, likely an attorney or a family member. It was a sad but apt symbol of hubris meeting consequence. Ultimately, the lawsuits culminated in a dramatic legal confrontation at the county courthouse. Though Karen's attorneys attempted to push blame onto the entire HOA, the newly reconstituted board cooperated with plaintiffs, demonstrating how Karen had single-handedly orchestrated the lump's extreme design and installation without a formal traffic study. They produced internal emails from Karen urging the contractor to make them extra tall, teach speeders a lesson. Some even had her mocking the idea of abiding by overly cautious guidelines. The mother's attorney laid out the injuries and property damage. Victims testified about the lumps and the intimidation they faced after complaining. One elderly resident described the excruciating back pain triggered by each drive to the grocery store. A local paramedic explained how ambulance response times had been slowed. It was devastating evidence. Karen's attorneys tried to defend her by citing the community's desire for safer roads, but the judge wasn't swayed. Official guidelines for speed humps were widely recognized. The lumps exceeded them, and her approach was ruled reckless and negligent. The fact that a child was seriously injured cemented the severity of the case. When a verdict came, it was brutal for Karen. She was found personally liable for a significant portion of damages. The judge scolded her in no uncertain terms. "Ms. Farncross, you weaponized public safety to impose your will, leading to real harm. You've disregarded professional warnings and displayed blatant contempt for standard engineering practices." Karen's face fell as the judge ordered her to pay substantial compensation to the injured family and other claimants with proven damages. She faced additional penalties for misusing HOA funds. While she wasn't immediately handcuffed, these were civil claims. Her financial ruin seemed inevitable, and the ongoing sabotage investigation hinted that criminal charges could follow if evidence linked her to the nails or other malicious acts. Soon after, the state attorney general's office hammered the final nail, a formal statement supporting the judge's findings, reminding HOAs across the region that no one was above basic safety regulations. If any still doubted it, Karen's downfall served as a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, the mother's attorney thanked me personally, acknowledging my behind-the-scenes role in alerting the commission to the hazard. I told her it was simply my duty, both as a professional and a neighbor. Not long after the verdict, the lawsuits forced Karen into bankruptcy. She couldn't pay the mandated restitution from her personal assets alone, so the court ordered the seizure of her property to help cover the judgments. Her pristine house, once a symbol of her self-appointed authority, now bore the signs of impending repossession, sealed notices on the door, a real estate auction listing. Neighbors who had endured her tyranny for years watched with a mixture of schadenfreude and relief. The day her possessions were cleared out, a row of trucks lined her driveway. Furniture, boxes, clothes, everything was cataloged for creditors. Karen appeared briefly, glowering at the men carrying out her belongings. Some claim she muttered curses about traitors and overregulation. A police officer supervised the process, ensuring no confrontations. By dusk, the trucks departed. Karen, with nowhere to go, presumably left the neighborhood for good. It was a quiet, ignominious end to her reign. That same week, the sabotage investigation concluded. While they couldn't definitively link her to the nails, lack of direct evidence, a separate felony charge was filed regarding her misappropriation of HOA funds. Facing potential jail time for fraud, Karen tried to plea bargain. The rumor was she'd likely accept a short prison sentence rather than risk a lengthy trial. The final details remained sealed, but suffice it to say, her future was grim. With Karen gone, Golden Oak Hills experienced a rebirth. The lumps were resculpted into standard speed humps or removed entirely, depending on the engineer's guidance. The roads soon felt normal again. Cars could safely traverse at the posted 25 miles per hour, no longer risking broken axles. Deliveries resumed without complaint, and mail carriers no longer threatened to skip service. The new HOA board, led by Harold, who had grown a backbone, instituted transparency measures. They revised the bylaws to require professional consultations and community votes on significant road changes. They also installed simpler traffic calming solutions, better signage, crosswalks with blinking lights, and mild speed cushions that aligned with recognized guidelines. Residents supported these rational measures wholeheartedly, grateful not to be terrorized by monstrous lumps. At the next community barbecue, folks thanked me openly for standing up to Karen. Some teased that they'd name me Honorary Road Commissioner of Golden Oak Hills. I chuckled, noting that I was just happy to see the neighborhood safe, freed from the overshadowing presence of Karen's meddling. Many neighbors discovered a sense of camaraderie that had been lacking. They organized block parties, formed a volunteer group to keep sidewalks tidy, and introduced a monthly newsletter celebrating birthdays and achievements rather than listing petty infractions. As for the mother and her injured daughter, they eventually settled the lawsuit, receiving compensation for medical bills and emotional distress. The daughter recovered well enough to resume mild sports, though she'd always remember the day a speed bump nearly derailed her future. She even wrote a short essay about the experience for a class project, concluding with, "Power must be checked before it becomes reckless." When I reflect on the entire ordeal, I'm reminded of how a single individual's obsession, Karen's crusade for safety by any means, can wreak havoc if unchecked. She exploited the HOA's structure, manipulated finances, and installed hazardous lumps with zero professional oversight. Only persistent pushback from local residents to higher authorities prevented greater tragedies. Eventually, Karen was sentenced for fraud related to her misuse of HOA funds. Reports suggested a year in county jail plus probation, though I never confirmed the final details. Her house was repossessed, her personal finances decimated by the civil judgments. She left behind a cautionary tale etched into the asphalt of Golden Oak Hills. On a personal note, I remained in the neighborhood, enjoying the newfound tranquility. My official role in traffic safety continued, with monthly trips to Washington, D.C. for meetings. But each time I returned to Golden Oak Hills, I smiled at the uniform, gently sloped speed humps. They were safe, consistent, and well-marked. No more jarring accidents or panic calls from neighbors. The streets hummed with a normal, modest level of traffic that posed no danger to families or vehicles. And so, the neighborhood sign, a safe, serene community for all, became genuine rather than ironic. Freed from Karen's tyranny, Golden Oak Hills truly was a place where children could bike without fear, seniors could drive without pain, and residents could breathe easy, confident that any future changes would be guided by reason, not reckless zeal. Months turned into a year, and the story of the monstrous speed bumps became neighborhood legend, recounted with a mix of exasperation and relief. New families moving in heard about the fiasco from friendly neighbors who'd grin and say, "At least we learned the importance of real traffic studies." The monstrous lumps themselves have been either flattened or replaced, so only pictures remained, a testament to how quickly a simple idea, like speed control, can become a nightmare in the wrong hands. Occasionally, the phrase "don't go full Karen" crept into local slang, meaning don't push an agenda so hard you ignore all professional advice and public outcry. The name Farncross was seldom mentioned. When it was, it evoked pity more than anger, a reminder of how pride can lead to personal and communal disaster. I continued my life in Golden Oak Hills, forging friendships, hosting barbecues, and quietly overseeing road safety on a national level. The place felt like home now. People might wonder how a calm, scenic suburb managed to generate so much drama, but that's the nature of power unbalanced. The real victory came when the community reclaimed its voice, insisted on sanity, and demanded accountability. In the end, that shared determination ended Karen's short-lived reign and left Golden Oak Hills safer than ever before.